In 1969, a military analyst, Daniel Ellsberg, who had decided that he opposed the Vietnam War, leaked portions of a classified internal history of America's actions to the New York Times and to the Washington Post. What came to be known as the Pentagon Papers made a number of revelations that had not previously been covered by the press. For instance, that the United States had expanded its war by bombing Cambodia and Laos, making coastal raids on North Vietnam, and through Marine Corps attacks. Most explosively, they showed that 4 presidential administrations had clearly misled the public. For example, the Eisenhower administration secretly worked against the Geneva Accords. John F. Kennedy's knew of plans to overthrow the South Vietnamese leader Ngo Dinh Diem before it happened in a coup in November 1963. President Johnson had promised "we seek no wider war" in his election campaign, but did the exact opposite in office. Ellsberg said that he had leaked the papers to try to end what he saw to be a wrongful war, and because they, quote, demonstrated unconstitutional behaviour by a succession of presidents, the violation of their oath, and the violation of the oath of every one of their subordinates. Ellsberg was charged under the Espionage Act, but was saved by the conduct of the agents of the White House. This was all contemporaneous with Watergate that resulted in a mistrial. We have seen, of course, other entries in the same playbook since, most notably the leak of NSA documents by the then intelligence contractor Edward Snowden in 2013. In that instance, again, the motivation was to draw the attention of the American people to what the leaker considered to be government misbehaviour, with the hope that that disclosure would force changes in that misbehaviour. In this case, Snowden revealed documents showing that the NSA was significantly and routinely overstepping its authority in surveillance of US citizens as well as America's allies abroad. Snowden again was charged under the Espionage Act, but evaded capture and is now living in that bastion of individual liberty, Russia, where he was granted refuge. President Obama's administration took steps to introduce reforms to the NSA and other programs, so Snowden's actions could be seen to have been at least partly successful. This all established the template. Leaks of intelligence by individuals who, and you can agree or disagree with whether you support them or not, did what they did to draw attention to what they perceived to be wrongs. The information tended to be older, highly embarrassing to the US politically, but in spite of what some politicians alleged at the time, not directly and immediately useful to America's enemies. Something they would have said was by design. Others pointed out that that wasn't their call to make, of course, and you can have that debate. This week we've seen the unfolding drama of another major leak, and yet in many ways it could not be more different from those that came before. Those previous leaks were framed around a specific narrative, motivated by creating change. The recent leaks, they have been scattergun at best. They were more recent documents. They had not been filtered with a view to avoiding immediate damage to American interests and those of their allies. And they were leaked with no noble intent whatsoever, from what we can tell, instead rather as an exercise of youthful bragging to what was intended to be a small, select peer group. A 21-year-old member of the Massachusetts Air National Guard, one Jack Texera, was arrested by the FBI. He was said to be a loner who had a fascination with the military, guns and war, a hostile attitude generally to the US authorities, who he believed behaved badly. The relatively lowly status of this leaker, along with some of the most damaging implications of what was leaked, particularly on the war in Ukraine, highlighted once again America's poor recent form in keeping things secret. At a time when it seemed presidents and vice presidents have been universally sloppy in saving top-secret papers for their scrapbooks, you could add to that a Secretary of State getting confidential correspondence going through her private email server. It was already bad enough. But now major secrets have come out because of this young man showing off to his teenage gaming pals. Is this an ally you would trust with your highly sensitive secrets? Certainly, if you're currently engaged in a fight to the death in your own country, you'd have to expect the answer would be no. While the Ukraine leadership have talked down the importance of the leak, the simple truth is that it has done them no favours whatsoever. It revealed American battlefield assessments that are pessimistic about Ukraine's ability to break through with a major counter-offensive. It catalogued shortfalls in artillery and munitions, being very specific about when things would run out, particularly on air defences, which could encourage Russia particularly to make a new push for air superiority that has so far been denied to them. We had an estimate of casualties on both sides, which surprised by being a little lower than some figures that have been discussed publicly. More than 40,000 Russians killed, against 17,500 likely dead on the Ukraine side. The US assessment is for an ongoing strategic stalemate, neither side being in a position to gain a decisive advantage. According to the documents, Russia has failed to secure significant foreign military aid, meaning that it has to rely on ramping up its domestic defence manufacturing, something that will take time, particularly in the face of shortages of key inputs such as high-end semiconductors. Confirmation of those difficulties, plus Russian infighting between its various agencies, has been, frankly, of little comfort to Ukraine. While putting a brave face on it, officials in Kiev are reportedly furious at the US intelligence suggesting that they will fail to recapture seized territory from Russia this spring. One anonymous official hit back, saying this: the same people who said Kiev would fall in 3 days are now leaking harmful and equally ridiculous information ahead of an offensive critically important for the entire free world. The official said that it gave them grounds for suspicion about just how seriously the US backed Ukraine's objectives of fully pushing Russia out of the country. The erosion of trust between allies is rather an important outcome if that's what's accelerated by this leak. There are certainly signs that the Biden administration sees that and is being energetic in trying to repair the damage. So Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba tweeted that Secretary of State Antony Blinken had called him to affirm America's ironclad support for Ukraine's capacity to win on the battlefield. And others have reported similar expressions from other key figures in the US administration and Defense Department. It's kind of what you would expect, but it seems an increasingly thin papering job over some pretty sizable and growing cracks between the US and Ukraine. Ukraine was not best pleased previously at leaks of US intelligence suggesting that Ukraine was linked to the assassination of Daria Dugina and that pro-Kiev groups might have been responsible for the sabotage of the Nord Stream pipelines. The US and Kiev are known to disagree about the strategic importance or otherwise of defending Bakhmut. Ukraine has invested a huge amount in holding it, while the White House just doesn't see it as major value and sees the fight for it as having been a drain on critical supplies of ammunition. There are disagreements over whether Ukraine should be aiming to retake Crimea. America thinks it's out of reach. President Zelensky disagrees. These sorts of disputes form the backdrop for a less than harmonious alliance, even if they don't in themselves undermine Ukraine's position in the war. More specifically concerning, in the short term, The leaked documents also gave information about up to 100 NATO Special Operations officials active in Ukraine, made up of French, American, British and Latvian operatives. Now that's the sort of detail that potentially puts people's lives at risk. Gavin Wild, a former employee of the White House and NSA, said that the document showed, in his mind, something of the enormous paradox at the heart of the American operation. There was a contradiction, he said, between the evidence that the US continues to wield enormous and highly effective intelligence gathering operations with detailed knowledge of what's happening in Russia as well as with its own allies, all the while demonstrating astonishing ineptness in actually handling the sensitive information after it's been gathered. A suggestion underlined by the fact that the recent documents appear to reveal sources and methods, the exposure of which would be likely to compromise the US's ability to continue, for example, to spy on Russia. One of the less surprising revelations, simply because it's not exactly news, is the fact that America continues to spy on its allies. This includes the Ukrainian leadership, but in these documents also Israel, where documents suggested the Israeli intelligence agency Mossad had been supporting protests against Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and Egypt, which is a US partner, having received billions in military aid, but is apparently possibly covertly supporting Russia with shipments of armaments. And then South Korea, where outrage has been sparked by the news that Seoul has been bypassing its rule not to sell weapons to countries at war by quietly backfilling ammunition stocks for the US and Poland to replace what they have sent to Ukraine. On the British side, well, there were some very specific and alarming revelations, a few of which have had very little discussion in the media. More about those in a moment, just after I take the briefest of pauses, with your indulgence, to thank the people who support this channel on Patreon. As many of you know, I could not produce these videos without that support, so I would just say, if you would like to add yours for the independent, fact-focused and non-ideological content I aim to produce here, please head on over to patreon.com/Mallen Baker. It is always appreciated. Now, on the British side, the documents revealed that there had nearly been a major incident on the 29th of September last year where a Royal Air Force RC-135 Rivet surveillance plane was fired upon by a Russian jet that was beyond visual range. British Defence Secretary Ben Wallace told Parliament that it was a potentially dangerous engagement against a routine patrol. The US privately regarded it as a near shoot-down, but the leaked documents show that it was an airborne sensitive reconnaissance operation, and such patrols are indeed gathering intelligence for Ukrainian forces. Not only that, but there have been more than a dozen surveillance missions over the Black Sea, at least 3 of which triggered some sort of Russian reaction. Only the first of those had been reported to Parliament, and since that one, Britain has used Typhoon fighter jets to escort the spy planes in case of additional problems. As I said, not much of that was reported by the UK media. It's all activity that you would say has to legitimately considered as highly provocative and appears to be ahead of the actions of other allies. Very much in the public interest, but clearly not the sort of detail that America's allies want to have exposed in a leak of this sort. The backdrop for all of this is a huge question mark in terms of the prevailing attitude towards the US from its allies. Just a few days ago, French President Macron created something of a stir, shall we say, when he visited China and suggested that it was not in Europe's interest simply to follow the lead of the United States when it came to China, for instance, in its situation with Taiwan. He said that Europe faces a great risk if it gets caught up in crises that are not ours, which prevents it from building its strategic autonomy. And he said Europe risks becoming the United States' vassal. The French leader has been arguing, of course, since Trump became president, that Europe has to have its own strategic military force, making it capable of operating as a third rising superpower rather than merely an adjunct to the one whose star is fading and which has proven itself to be unreliable. Still, this was the most direct intervention yet to project into the relationship with an emerging China the idea that maybe you should be standing more equidistant between them and the old allies. As you would expect, the statement provoked a lot of pushback. Central and Eastern European leaders particularly were dismayed. Polish Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki said that Europe should be building a strategic partnership with the US, not strategic autonomy from them. Other officials said Macron was freelancing again and that his views do not represent the EU's position. That may be true right now. The question is whether Macron is the advance guard for a changing mood or whether he's simply an outlier, and that will always remain the case. European Council President Charles Michel suggested that, to the contrary, European leaders are becoming increasingly favourable towards Macron's push for strategic autonomy. He said that the comments reflected a growing shift amongst EU leaders compared to just several years ago. And he said this: on the issue of the relationship with the United States, some European leaders wouldn't say the things the same way that Emmanuel Macron did. I think quite a few really think like Emmanuel Macron. It wasn't, he said, that Macron was hostile to the US, just that the EU should not blindly and systematically follow its position on all issues. Now, obviously, if one of those issues is Taiwan, that opens up a rather major geopolitical question mark. One rather highlighted by the fact that the Chinese carried out provocative military exercises around Taiwan almost the minute after Macron and Ursula von der Leyen had left Chinese airspace after their recent visit. And of course, such messages create a momentum of their own. Some GOP lawmakers responded aggressively. Representative Chris Smith, chair of the Congressional Executive Commission on China, said this: if France is truly committed to abandoning democratic nations in favour of a brutal communist regime, the United States must reassess its posture towards France. Now, the actual position of the administration, of course, has been to downplay the controversy, to stress its positive partnership with the French. But these are just the public blandishments that, as the intelligence leak has shown, don't usually reflect the real story behind the scenes. And in many ways, that's the point. And the main distinction between this recent intelligence leak, with its rather odd circumstances, and those previous ones. In the past, those leaks were whistleblowers drawing relatively careful attention to how an overmighty America, then the dominant force in a unipolar world, was overreaching, exercising power without due accountability. The newest leak testifies rather more to the sense of America as a power in decline. Helpless to give its allies in Ukraine the edge in the ongoing war, spying on its allies as they consider sending weapons to its enemies, or turning to its competitor China for diplomatic weight and support. And all that leaked because the US now has over 1 million people, apparently, who have top secret clearance, and they have no real system or willpower to impose the appropriate discipline to keep their secrets secret. All things told, this is a very different story to those previous leaks. We can expect to see the themes for the outlines breaking more and more into the private and then the public discourse between world leaders. And it doesn't seem to be a process that hinges a lot on who wins the next US election. interestingly. The day when Joe Biden strode into his first summit and announced America's back, that seems like a very long time ago. It's not over by any means, but momentum is an important thing in geopolitics, and more than anything else, this leak has highlighted that momentum is massively shifting.
Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please share with anyone else you think would also enjoy it. Word of mouth is really important to us. And if you've not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? As the saying goes, that subscribe button won't smash itself.